back from the tomb, and she said, the tomb is empty. Can you imagine what went through their minds? I jotted down some thoughts that I kind of guessed might have been part of the response of the disciples. What did you say? What do you mean? Are you sure? How could this happen? Where is he? What do we do now? We better get out of here. Because you remember, they're hiding out because they were concerned about what was going to happen. To say that they were surprised would be a great understatement. It wouldn't even begin to touch the reality of their emotions. And yet, the irony is, at least 3 specific times in the weeks leading up to Jesus' crucifixion, death, and resurrection, Jesus told his disciples that he was going to go to Jerusalem, he was going to be crucified, and that he was going to die. Let me just share them with you. Mark chapter 8. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And then Mark adds this little additional thought. And he said this plainly. Jesus didn't stumble over his words. He wasn't unclear in his communication. He was very direct and very to the point. This is what's going to happen. And it will happen in this kind of fashion. Mark chapter 9, just a few days later. They went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples and saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed after 3 days, he will rise again. And then Mark adds this thought. But they did not understand the saying, and they were afraid to ask him. Have you ever had somebody, you said something to somebody and they did exactly the opposite of what you wanted them to do, and you say something to them, something like this. What part of no didn't you understand? You know, what part of I'm going to Jerusalem, they're going to arrest me, they're going to kill me, and I'm going to come back after 3 days. What part of that do you not understand? And yet, we see that that's the case. And then lastly in Mark, I forgot to write this reference down, I think it's about the 11th chapter. And they were going on the road, going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was going to happen, saying, see, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him, even goes into more detail, and they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise again. He told them plainly, and he repeated it twice. But they were still surprised, and they were still taken back when the ladies come to their upper room on Resurrection Sunday morning, and they say, the tomb is empty. The tomb is empty. They were still surprised. It's why Jesus told them so many times in advance. In John's Gospel, he says this to them, I told you in advance so that when it happens, you'll know that I told you before it happened. So that when it does happen, you'll believe in me. But beyond the reminders, Jesus told them because it was going to be the hallmark of who he was as a person. John chapter 10, verses 17 and 18, Jesus makes this statement. For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it up again. Now listen to what he says. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father. There's no other person who ever lived who could make that statement.
Amen.
Now, there are some of us who have laid our lives down. We celebrate at least 2 or 3 times annually people who have laid down their lives for their country. Some folks have laid their lives down in other fashion. But Jesus said, I lay it down and I will pick it up again. That's unique. That puts him in a completely different category. It sets Jesus apart from everyone else. Anyone else that would say that? If somebody told you, you met them on the street today, somebody told you, oh yeah, I can lay my life down anytime I want and I'll pick it up at will. What would be your next move? Run. Or call the sheriff's department and turn them in on a 5150. Because they would have to be, if not insane, close to insane. And yet Jesus said this was what he was going to do. And he did the very thing that he said that he was going to do. So the resurrection sets him apart in unique fashion. There are 2 points that I want to leave you with today. Not going to be long, but I feel like it's important for me to share these 2 things with you because the title of my message this morning, as you see behind me, is Risen. Risen. He is.
Amen.
He is risen. We have Jesus' declaration of his intent to the disciples. He said, this is what I'm going to do. And then he went out and did exactly what he said he was going to do. But we have also the record of the Scriptures. Mark chapter 16 records this after Jesus' resurrection, or after his crucifixion. When the Sabbath was passed, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. And they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb? And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe. And they were alarmed. And he said to them, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. Now, the interesting thing is these ladies had been involved in burying Jesus. The reason why they were coming back is that at the time of this burial, they hadn't had all of the necessary spices and preparations to bury him in a permanent fashion because it was so close to the end of the Sabbath, or to the beginning of the Sabbath, they didn't want to violate the Sabbath. And so now the same ladies are coming back. Have you ever walked into a place where you set something down and you knew you set it there? No. And then you can't find it? You know, somebody said, do you believe in the hereafter? And the person said, yes, I do. I walk into a room all the time and wonder, what am I hereafter? These ladies walked in the tomb that day. They walked in the tomb that day, and can't you just see it? They walk in and they know exactly where so they start over there. And what do they find? They find an angel. And the angel says, sorry, he's not here. He's not here. They had come back to finish their job. And now they find out it's not necessary for them to finish the job because it wasn't needed. He had risen from the dead. And he finishes up by saying, don't be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Now stop with me just for a second here, because this is a very interesting statement. Because we already read that Jesus said to the disciples, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, they're going to kill me, I'm going to be buried, I'm going to rise again on the third day, but he went a step further. And he said, and when I'm risen again, I will meet you in Galilee. I will meet you in Galilee, so you guys come on, and I'll meet you there. The prophecy of the resurrection and of his return for the disciples happened just as Jesus said that it would. Interestingly, each of the Gospels declares the truth of the resurrection. Each one of them. Each records the clear story of Jesus rising from the dead. The resurrection, as time would go on, the resurrection would become the single factor in the message that the apostles would carry. The resurrection became the single factor of greatest importance because there had been all kinds of other people who had proclaimed themselves to be the Christ. There had been many other people who had come and even had led rebellions, but when they were killed, they all died, and they were never heard from again. And now here we have Jesus, who has not led a rebellion in the sense that the others did, but simply led a rebellion of healing and of loving and of caring and of serving. They killed him. And now after his death, he has risen from the grave, and no one can figure out how it happened. The disciples, because no one else could do that, and the disciples carried that. When you read the messages that they preach as they go into new cities, as you see Paul going into new cities, inextricably connected to the message of the gospel of Jesus is that he rose from the dead and ascended back to heaven. And folks, that is what made Jesus different. Is there any other evidence for Jesus' actual bodily resurrection? There is. I shared this with the folks at Compassion yesterday. I'd like to share it with you this morning. There is no credible scholar. Let me say that for you again. There is no credible scholar or historian who does not believe that Jesus lived and that he was crucified by Pontius Pilate. Two of the most outstanding examples are Tacitus, who was a Roman historian, and Josephus, who was a Hebrew historian. Josephus even goes into greater detail, affirming the fact that Jesus rose from the grave. If you talk about Josephus, Josephus is considered hands down to be a reputable historian. Tacitus makes a similar claim about the coming of Jesus and his crucifixion by Pontius Pilate. There is no credible historian who does not believe that that took place. Number two, Jesus was buried in the tomb of a man by the name of Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph was not, although he was a member of the council, the Sanhedrin council, Joseph was not a major player on the landscape. If the fact of where Jesus was buried was not important and significant, why would they even mention Joseph of Arimathea? He would be unnecessary. He would simply be a person who happened to be alive at the time of Jesus. Yet it was a specific fact that was mentioned so people would be able to know where Jesus had been buried. Point number three, the tomb was discovered empty on the third day. But ladies, who discovered the empty tomb?
Ladies.
Ladies. Thank you, ladies. And ladies, I mean absolutely no disrespect. But in Jesus' day, a woman would not be allowed to testify in a court because her testimony was not seen as reliable. Just because she was a woman. We've come a long way. So let me ask you a question. Why then would the church appeal to the witness of unreliable witnesses to validate the resurrection of Jesus if it hadn't really occurred? It would have been silly. It would have been laughable. They would have been laughed out of court had they tried to bring those witnesses into the courtroom. And yet, boldly, they declare that it was Mary and the other ladies that we just read about who were the first to find Jesus not being in the tomb. Why would they do that if it weren't true? Number 4, many credible witnesses saw Jesus alive. We calculated the other day, as we were talking at Compassion, that there is a biblical record of somewhere in the vicinity of 580 to 590 people who saw Jesus alive after his resurrection. Paul records this in 1 Corinthians 15. He talks about the people that Jesus appeared to, and he said at one point, Jesus appeared to 500 people at one time, people who were alive at the time Paul was writing what he was writing. Now, do you think for 1 minute, if any of those folks knew that Jesus had not resurrected from the dead, that they would have allowed Paul to get away with that? Of course they wouldn't. They would not have allowed it, and neither would anyone else in that time period. And the last thing, which you may have heard before, but I think it's a very powerful witness to the reality of the resurrection. And I'll ask you, like I asked the folks at Compassion yesterday, if you knew someone had told you a lie, and you were basing your life on a lie, would you be willing to die for that lie? How many of you would sign up for that? I'm going to lie to you, and it probably will cost you your life. There's not any sane, sensible person who will sign up for that kind of situation. And yet, listen to what happened to all the disciples. Every disciple, except John, died a martyr's death. Peter was crucified upside down. Now, folks, being crucified at all is bad enough. Being crucified upside down is what Paul himself was. It's understood that he was beheaded for the gospel. John, the only one who lived and died a natural death, was boiled in oil for the gospel. Thomas went as far as India in preaching the gospel and laid down his life. Every disciple laid down his life for the gospel, and many, many more that we don't know about. Now I ask you, why would you do that for something that you knew to be a lie? Because you see, that was the testimony that was made that day. Well, the disciples came and they stole his body so that it would look like he had resurrected from the grave. If they had done that as a ruse, I guarantee you, just like you and me, none of them would be willing to lay down their lives for that. And so it's a reasonable conclusion. Does it lie outside the parameters of what you and I would normally think? Of course it does. None of us have ever seen anyone resurrected from the dead. Although there are times in history when we've read it, the scriptures record it. I read accounts from time to time of people who are miraculously raised from the dead, but that's not something that you and I find happening every day. And so certainly it lies outside the boundaries of what you and I would normally think. And yet, Jesus said he would do it. The history of the witnesses that were there said that that's what happened. And then thirdly, it has been borne out in the transformed lives of the disciples. And so we're on safe ground to embrace the idea that the resurrection is truly something that took place. But the second thing that I want you to see with me this morning is that it's not just about Jesus having been resurrected from the dead, but it's that we have been raised with him. We have been raised. You see, if we're here this morning to sing and to relive and to talk about something that's simply a historical event, divorced from any kind of relevance to where you and I are today, it might be something that we would enjoy doing. People do that all the time. Last weekend in Knights Ferry, I think it was, they reenacted a Civil War battle, and that's fun, and it's fun to go do that. But if the resurrection doesn't have some kind of tie back to where you and I live today, then it's just another historical fact that really has no bearing on where we are. And yet, when we look at what the Scriptures have to say to us, the resurrection has meaning for you and for me today. Because we are told that in the same way that Jesus rose from the grave, that we too have been raised. And you say, yeah, I know, when Jesus comes. I'm talking about right now. Let me share it with you. His resurrection was the open door to life for each one of us. And we find in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 19 through 23, that the resurrection established Jesus as Lord of all that is. That when he rose from the grave, Ephesians tells us that Jesus was taken back to heaven. He is seated at the Father's right hand, and all authority is his. All authority is his. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 4 through 7 says this: we are alive with Christ after the resurrection today. And catch this, we have been made to sit in heavenly places with him. Just as he was raised to go back to the Father, and all authority and all honor go to him, he has allowed us to share in that. And we have been raised. And in the same way that Jesus is the authority over all that is, Paul goes on to say it's principalities and it's powers. It's every kind of authority that exists in the world, that Jesus is now elevated beyond that. But the wonderful thing is, he says that we have been lifted there with Jesus. That means that the reality for you and I of the resurrection isn't just about some historical thing that happened a long time ago or some date way in the future that we're waiting for. It's the reality that today, the same power and authority that rose Jesus from the dead, God wants to implant in our lives. Amen. So that the challenges of life, does anybody here have challenges of life? Anybody here have stuff that just kind of slaps you upside of the head and catches you from nowhere, and you don't see it coming, and when it comes, you don't know what to do with it? Paul tells us that the same power that raised Christ from the dead, he has made available to us. And he wants to release that power into our lives today. It's the power of the resurrection. Can you think with me for a second about the power of the resurrection? What would it take to raise Jesus from the dead? What would it take to put life back into a lifeless body? What would it take to restart all of those organs that had shut down? What would it take to cause the heart that had been penetrated by the centurion's spear to begin to work again and to be able to pump the blood that was necessary for Jesus' body to begin to work again? What would that take? It's an incredible power that God generated into Jesus that caused him to rise from the dead. And Paul says very clearly that the same power that was given to Jesus, God has seated you and me with Christ at the same table, so that the same power that worked in Jesus will work in us. That's where the resurrection becomes important for you and I. Because it then begins to touch where we are. Because of the resurrection of Jesus, he has been given that authority, and we are seated with him. And the challenges that you and I face daily, the challenges that you and I encounter just by being alive, just by living next door to somebody that you live next door to, just by being married to the person that you are married to. Okay? Sometimes things come into our lives that come in the form of illness that you and I can't anticipate. Sometimes there are genetic things that are buried in your family's past, and all of a sudden it crops up in the life of a child that's born into your family. And you think, my God, how will I deal with that? I have friends who have a child that's Down syndrome. How do you deal with those kinds of challenges on a day-by-day basis? And we could go on and on and on and talk about those kinds of things. Because when you face those kinds of challenges, you all feel very weak. We sat with my mom last night. And some of the things that she's walking through right now. How do you deal with that? For those of you that don't know, my mom had a stroke this past week. And that's presented her with some real challenges. And here's the kicker, folks. She already had a little dementia, and she was already essentially blind. And now she has a stroke. And that's where people can sometimes say, you know what, God, where are you?
Yes.
And God wants us to realize that that's why he sent Jesus into the world. Because when we face those kinds of challenges, the same power that raised Jesus from the dead is available to us. And you say, so then you're thinking God's going to heal your mom. I'd be totally thrilled with that. But you know what he does sometimes? He gives us the ability to deal with what's in front of us. Yes. He gives us the grace. And you can say, well, then he's not really a very good God. Okay, you tell me. Because those are decisions that are well beyond my ability to decide. What is made available to me is the strength and the love and the grace of a God who says, yeah, I know you. Your mom's been dealt a tough hand. You've been dealt a tough hand. And here I am to walk with you. Okay? Because part of what we often think sometimes about things like the resurrection is all of a sudden everything gets made to be rosy and easy. No, it's God who comes to give us the strength to deal with the unexpected realities of life that you and I don't have any other way to cope with. And he helps us realize that strength day by day as we trust him. See, that's what the resurrection has come to tell us. Because Jesus rose from the dead, it tells us that the God who made everything that we see is bigger than any of the life realities that we see around us. And he is able to help you and I draw from his strength in order to be able to live the life that's before us. So the resurrection isn't just a historical event. It's something that comes and has impact on us where we are today. Would you bow your heads with me?